This series presents information based in part on theory and conjecture. The producer's purpose is to suggest some possible explanations, but not necessarily the only ones, to the mysteries we will examine.
During American involvement in the Vietnam War, 57,000 men lost their lives. Over 100,000 wounded were rescued. During air missions over the jungles of Vietnam and Laos, over 1,000 Americans were shot down or lost control of their planes. Their fellow officers were the last to see them alive. What happened to our servicemen who went down behind enemy lines? Men who were known to be alive on the ground. Could new evidence mean that Americans are still alive in the jungles of Indochina? Spring 1973, Operation Homecoming. American servicemen were coming home. Nearly 10 years have passed since that day of reunion. Today, the families of 2,500 men who didn't come home wonder what has become of them. Over 100 of those men were confirmed POWs at the war's end, and 1,300 were listed as missing in action. Bat Masterson was probably best known as a funny man, a kidder, a guy with a great sense of humor. He married Fran in the spring of 1968, and he headed off to war. 6 months later, while flying in formation over Laos, the pilot of another plane heard Bat's message of trouble. He was experiencing vertigo. He was bailing out. The years have not dimmed the memory of that day for Fran and her daughter Sherry.
All that day I had a very uneasy feeling, and my throat was like it was closing or something. I just felt very, very strange. And I was thinking of Bat all the time, and I felt like something had happened to him, but I wasn't sure. And the next day, it was about 11 o'clock on October the 14th, which in retrospect was the day after he had gone down. There was a knock at the door, and I opened the door, and there were 2 Air Force men at the door. And I knew something had happened to him, and I closed the door in their face. And one of them had gotten their foot in the door, and he was saying, "Mrs. Masterson," and I'm screaming at him to go away, go away. I didn't know what they were telling me. They said that, your husband is missing in action, and I figured he was dead. I didn't know what missing in action really meant.
Colonel Bat Masterson was a professional soldier, a highly skilled officer trained to elude capture. He and his fellow Air Force officers were prepared to do whatever became necessary to survive in the jungles and make their way to safety. Whatever happened in those hours or days in the jungle may never be known. Did Bat Masterson disappear? Was he captured? Or were he and the other 1,300 MIAs simply forgotten in the excitement of the war's end? Paris, 1973. Vietnam peace talks show progress. On January 27th, Secretary of State Henry Kissinger brings an official end to American involvement in Vietnam. The years of bloodshed end with a handshake. Peace is declared.
And tonight, the day we have all worked and prayed for has finally come. For the first time in 12 years, No American military forces are in Vietnam. All of our American POWs are on their way home.
But what became of the 1,300 MIAs, the 100 known prisoners of war? Were they left behind enemy lines?
I believe there are men alive. I know there are men alive. Whether one of them's my husband or not, I don't know that, of course.
Marion Volman was 13 when she met Charles Shelton, 18 when she married him. They raised a family and traveled from one air base to another. When Captain Shelton was captured in 1965, 5 children waited for his return home.
I circled the White House in a camper for a week, telling the public that the prisoners, not all the prisoners, came home. And I have been fighting with the United States government and appealing to the American public to do something to get accounting for these men.
Other wives and family members demanded answers. Family members like John Shelton, who was 9 years old when his father was taken prisoner.
I don't feel like the government has done all it can do, and I am bitter because I think that there are lies going on. I think that there are things that aren't being said, and I think they're trying to cover up.
It was very difficult to get an accounting for our missing people. It wasn't because the United States government was cold, was uncaring, or didn't want to in any way get an accounting for the missing. It was just that it was exceedingly difficult to get any cooperation from the other side.
Colonel John Furrer spent 7 years in a Vietnamese prison camp. Today, he's the principal advisor for the Office of POW MIA Affairs.
From my viewpoint, it's a frustrating situation that demands positiveness and a degree of optimism that one of these days we'll get cooperation from the Vietnamese to account for our missing.
Today, all but 13 of the 1,300 MIAs have been reclassified as presumed dead. Where is Captain Charles E. Shelton, who remains the last officially recognized prisoner of war? Confined to a wheelchair as a result of his treatment at the hands of his captors, former POW Thomas Nixon believes there are servicemen alive in Vietnam. His concern led him to serve as the National Service Officer for the American ex-prisoners of war.
For Vietnam, there were basically 3 different types of prisoners. The first group were officers, better educated. They would fly over North Vietnam and they would be shot down. They would often be put in solitary confinement. Their only avenue of escape from the torture of being alone for long periods of time, as much as 7 years, was to use mind games, think about their loved ones, to work out complex puzzles, to stare at the wall and decide that they were looking at a moving picture, all kinds of things. They all have a different story. The second group were those who were captured by the North Vietnam regulars. They often took these prisoners and marched them to camps in North Vietnam. And the third group were those who were captured by the so-called Viet Cong, and they lived in the jungles, and they lived on whatever food they could get. And the greatest tragedy was that they were never stabilized in a camp till near the end of the war or conflict.
Air Force Colonel Leo Thorsness, captured on April 30th, 1967, released 1973.
We tried for 6 years, as did they, to figure each other out, to outguess each other, to think like each other thought. And I think we got closer, but we never really understood the other side. We would go to different camps, and we got to know the camps. And every few months or a year, they'd move you. And it would take you maybe a week, a month, a year, several months at least, to find some identification of who'd been in that cell before you. Maybe there was a little window way up top, and the season changed enough for the sun to light up a different section of the wall, and you'd find a faint name or initials and dates and so on. It'd be one of us. of that list we memorized of who we knew alive in the system.
It seems difficult to believe that men could have survived the conditions of POW life after so many years. With the post-war flight of Vietnamese refugees came disturbing stories. They came from boat people as rumors, later confirmed by lie detector tests. They were the stories of Caucasians seen in the jungles, in caves, in prison camps. Live sighting reports of Americans held in Southeast Asia number over 1,000. 300 of these sightings are first-hand. 1976, 3 years after peace is declared, a number of Americans were spotted in Laos. Another first-hand sighting reported 4 Americans held at Tan Khan. At Kanto Prison in the Mekong Delta, one refugee claims he saw 3 Americans held among the 800 prisoners. 1980, a number of Americans previously held in Hanoi were seen in Han Tan.
The director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, which has responsibility for investigating all of these reports, testified before Congress, a subcommittee of Congress, that relative to Americans that are unaccounted for, at this time, he's been unable to substantiate the information, and that they cannot correlate it with any missing or any unaccounted for Americans.
The remains of 1,100 soldiers were never returned. One sighting claims that 400 bodies were in a warehouse near Hanoi. When investigated, it was found empty. Were the bodies removed? Vietnam, nearly 10 years after the war's end. Do camps holding American prisoners still exist? Are they the places of squalor and brutality described during the war? The question is why? Why hold Americans captive today? Ann Griffiths, Executive Director of the National League of Families, has some answers.
Well, they've made it pretty clear that they want several things from our government. They would like very much to have normalized relations with our government, which would also then result in lifting of the trade embargo, which would improve their economic situation measurably, would allow greater distribution of humanitarian assistance to people in Vietnam. They would also like for the United States to intercede with the People's Republic of China to help ward off what they perceive as a continuing and ongoing threat from the Chinese, and which has evidenced itself over and over since 1979.
Prisoners could still be there because they are labor. Feeding them is no great problem because they feed them just enough to keep them alive to do the work. And so they are suffering from malnutrition. Doesn't make that much difference. They're not getting medical care. They're just being worked.
The Defense Department remains skeptical, and if the reports are true, rescue seems impossible.
When you deal with other countries, you're talking about sovereign nations, and the State Department, of course, can address this much better than I can, but you just can't crank up and go into somebody else's backyard. It's just not done.
1978. One man claims the government asked him to look into the matter. Bo Greitz, a highly decorated Special Forces commander.
When this thing first came up, I was as shocked as anyone could have been. I had assumed that in 1973, with the Accords, all the prisoners were returned. That's what the president said. I bought it. I was satisfied with it. I didn't put this bracelet on. And when I was directed to look into this matter, I was shocked to find that, in fact, our servicemen are still there. Those servicemen have kept the faith in this country, in God, and I hope in the Special Forces, because we're going to be the ones to liberate them when the time comes.
A rescue operation was devised. 13 former Green Berets were assembled at a camp in Florida. Training began.
These people left their way of life. They dropped their job instantly. They left their wives, their families, their occupation. They left it on a phone call from me that said, We have information about American prisoners, and I'd like for you to be a part of a rescue operation. Now the big problem. If they're alive, where are they being held? And how are we going to get them out?
Maps were scrutinized for the safest possible plan. The men trained around the clock, honing the skills they had used to fight a war 15 years ago. Spring 1980, Operation Velvet Hammer is ready to go.
We were into phase 2 when we got word to stand down. The word was simply that the president is excited about this and he's going to do it with government forces. And therefore, we were requested to stand down. Since we are not at any time on the outside of the law with this thing, we deferred to our country, be it right or wrong. Now that I look at it, of course, it was the wrong decision.
May 1980. The United States stages its own raid. The plan was to send in Laotian ground forces to confirm the presence of Americans seen in U.S. satellite pictures. The Laotians claimed they found no one.
I think what happened to them, intelligence gave them a good package. They just weren't able, with all of their analysts and requirements, to get it together quick enough to respond. Suddenly, they ran out of weather, they ran out of information, and rather than just say, hey, we blew it, they're saying, look, we did our very best. We've even got 2 Laotian indigenous patrols that say there weren't any Americans there. And so we'll try again next year. But how can you call the ball game off because of rain in Laos when we got prisoners still over there who have kept faith?
The Defense Intelligence Agency will always pursue these investigations pertaining to the unaccounted for Americans with the idea that there is at least one or more Americans being held against their will in Southeast Asia. And the reason that they will proceed from this position is that any other attitude, anything less than that, would not give them the incentive or the enthusiasm or the vigor which this important issue commands.
Of going back to Washington, D.C. and dealing with the State Department and the Department of Defense and all their classified material that they won't let us see and everything, I don't believe anything they say.
October 1968, Bat Masterson disappears, leaving behind the beginning of a new life. Marion Shelton kisses her husband goodbye one morning in 1965. Time has passed, children have grown up, but the years are filled with uncertainty and loneliness.
I think all of us who are prisoners, I can only speak for myself for sure, but I think it's typical that I have an ambivalent feeling of wanting to do more to solve this problem, to prove it or not prove it, and if there are some there, to get them home. The other side of it is, it was a tough grind while we were there for all of us, and now we're home and we have a family, or we want to start our life over and kind of get that behind us.
If I found out that Bat died yesterday, I would be very mad. I would be very irate. But if I found out that he died during the war, like when he went down, then it would be okay. But if he died useless, you know, like being killed or something like that, while the war was over, he was supposed to be here. He's not supposed to be there. And that would really upset me.
Reasonably, I don't think he's going to come home. I dream about it. I think emotionally, I think he'll be home. I need him to be home. I dream about him coming home all the time. You know, everyone has the reoccurring, realistic dreams they always have, and that one still occurs.
I could take it if my husband was dead, if I knew that he was dead. And of course, I would love for him to be alive. Sometimes when I think of him being alive and coming back, I wonder just what he would think that he'd been abandoned all these years.
It is important for us to bury our dead, to pay them tribute, to recall their memories, to lay them to rest. But can we lay to rest a memory that may still be alive? It is the 1980s. Vietnam seems years and miles away. But close to the hearts and minds of their loved ones is the fate of the 2,500 who never came home.
Coming up next, 20th Century with Mike Wallace chronicles the triumph of Apollo 11 and the tragedy of the Challenger. Then Weapons at War tracks the evolution of famous small arms from mini cannons to laser-aimed rifles.